Last time we were together, we talked about types of surveys and how to choose a sample that perfectly represents your population. But even if you do everything right and you pick the perfect sample, there are still errors that can occur. So we're going to talk about those types of errors, and in statistics, we call those errors bias. Bias occurs when there are errors in a study that result in a statistic that does not accurately reflect the population. So we could get a statistic that isn't accurate because of different types of bias. So we're going to look at 5 scenarios and describe what type of bias is taking place. The first scenario is in 1936. A Literary Digest had a voter survey, and they predicted that Landon would beat Roosevelt in the presidential election. And if you think back on your list of presidents, Franklin Roosevelt's definitely in there, and Alfred Landon is not. So they predicted wrong. Their sample was drawn from telephone directories and car registration lists. In 1936, people who owned cars and telephones tended to be more affluent and vote Republican. If we think about people today who own cars and telephones versus people in 1936, we know that a lot more people today own cars and telephones. In 1936, it means that everybody who didn't own a car or a telephone were left out, and that was a lot of people. So the type of bias that occurred is called undercoverage bias. And that happens when segments of the target population are excluded. So undercoverage literally means that they're not covered the way every other segment of the population is. So they're excluded or underrepresented. And take note that this is the fault of the researcher. The Literary Digest messed up here when they did their poll because they didn't survey all voters. They only surveyed people who own cars and telephones. And in 1936, that was a limited group. So the first type of bias is undercoverage bias. So the next thing, the survey above was conducted as a mail-in survey. So that means that they sent out 10 million questionnaires and people responded. So of those 10 million questionnaires, only 2.3 million people responded, which is about 23% of people. So the 7.7 million who didn't respond turned out to be really different in terms of their political preference. So this occurs today when you hang up on callers who want to survey you. If you ever get a phone call from a telemarketer that says, "Can I ask you a few questions?" then you hang up the phone. That is what is occurring. So it's when people chosen for the sample are unwilling or unable to respond. And the name of this bias is called non-response. It's a little bit different from undercoverage because undercoverage is the fault of the researcher. When we did undercoverage here, the researcher, Literary Digest, excluded people. But here, this scenario, 10 million people were talked to. 7.7 million of them straight up didn't respond. That's not the researcher's fault. Instead, this is the fault of the respondents. So that's how you can tell the difference between undercoverage and non-response. Undercoverage means the researcher didn't ask the whole group of people, and non-response means the respondents didn't answer. All right, here's a third kind of bias. A job applicant is asked to take a personality test, and one of the questions is, do you like meeting new people? So the applicant thinks this is a customer service job. The company's probably looking for somebody who likes to meet new people. So even though they're an introvert at heart and they kind of just like hanging out with their group of friends instead of meeting new people, the applicant answers yes in an attempt to increase their chances of being hired. So this type of bias occurs when people lie. It's called response bias. People respond, but they may not respond accurately. Their response might be inaccurate or even false. All right, the fourth type of bias occurs when we look at different types of questions. So, example question 1, cigarettes cause lung cancer. Would you like your child to smoke cigarettes? Or example question 2, is it not possible that education does not imply success? These questions both have problems. They're different problems, but we can agree that question wording is an issue. The first question is called a leading question because it leads people who respond to a specific answer. Cigarettes cause lung cancer. Would you like your child to smoke cigarettes? Most people are going to say no because of the way the question is worded. The second question doesn't lead you in a specific answer. In fact, it's hard to understand what it's asking in the first place. It's simply confusing. So question wording can occur when questions lead you in a certain direction or if the question is just really poorly written. Finally, the last type of bias is exemplified here. Hosts of television competitions like American Idol ask their viewers to send in their responses for who they think should win the competition. This is called voluntary response bias. And this occurs when respondents are self-selected volunteers. So when you think about people who vote for television competitions or who even leave reviews on Google, those people tend to have more extreme views. Usually you don't call in to vote for something if you don't have an extreme opinion. So voluntary response bias leaves out people with middle-of-the-road meh opinions because when people select themselves to volunteer how they feel, they usually feel either very positively and more often very negatively. So we're going to look at some examples of polls and identify what kind of bias there are. So first, a local radio station asks listeners to call in and share their opinions on controversial topics like politics. This is called voluntary response bias. Remember, voluntary response bias comes from people selecting themselves to respond. Next, a researcher calls numbers from a local telephone book to survey individuals on their comfort with technology use. Think about a telephone book today. What kind of numbers are in a telephone book? Landlines, right? And most people who still use their landline regularly aren't using a cell phone regularly. So think about people that might fit into that group. It might be the elderly. It might be people who aren't comfortable with cell phones. So this is leaving people out for sure. But the question is, whose fault is it? Is it the fault of the researcher for leaving people out, or is it the fault of the respondents for being unwilling to answer? In this case, it's the fault of the researcher. So this is under coverage because groups of people are literally not being covered. All right, next one. A researcher asks individuals, do you think the city should risk an increase in pollution by allowing expansion of the Northern Industrial Park? This is an example of question wording bias. And your clue here is risk an increase in pollution. Nobody wants to risk an increase in pollution, and so the question leads them to a certain answer. Instead, you could just say, do you think the city should allow the expansion of the Northern Industrial Park? And that way people aren't led one way or the other by the question. This next one, a research asks individuals, if you found a wallet with $100 in the street, would you return it to the owner or keep it? This is a case of response bias. People lie, and people lie to seem desirable or to fit in. In this case, if you might keep the $100, you might lie and say you'd return it, even if that's not true, because you want to be socially desired. Next, Wake County Public School teachers are emailed a survey about potential changes in school start times. 60% of teachers delete the email without opening the survey. So again, we know that people are being underrepresented, but the question is it the fault of the researcher or is it the fault of the respondents? In this case, it's the fault of the respondents, so this is non-response bias. People were asked, but they were unwilling or unable to respond. Finally, a student asks his classmates in band class their opinions on funding the fine arts. If you think about asking students in a band class about funding the fine arts, their answers are probably going to lean a certain way. People are being left out here. We're not asking kids in any other class. So, this is definitely people being left out. The question is it the fault of the researcher or the respondents? In this case, it's the fault of the student, the researcher, because they only asked the band class. They didn't ask the whole school and only the band class answered. They only asked the band class. So this is under coverage. And then bonus, what kind of sample is this? This is where we think back to our last lesson. What kind of sample method did the student use? This is a convenience sample. Because the student didn't choose in any random or systematic way. They just chose what was easiest. The student's right there, his classmates in his band class. All right. So we're going to switch gears a little bit at the end of this. So far, we focused on surveys. And surveys occur when individuals respond to a question or a prompt. But surveys aren't the only way to collect data. There's other ways as well. We're going to look at two other ways to collect data in addition to surveys. The first way is called an observational study. And the key word in there is observe. Those occur when individuals are observed. And data is collected, but there's no attempt made to affect outcomes or change the outcomes. So surveys fall into this category because we observe the data that we're given, but we don't try to impact the outcomes. Experiments are a little bit different. Experiments occur when we impose treatments. Then we observe. So we impose treatments prior to an observation. We want to show a cause and effect relationship. And the only way to do that is with an experiment. So we are going to look at two examples, and we're going to decide if this is an observation, if we're simply looking at what's going on, or if we're imposing some sort of treatment or change to just demonstrate a cause or effect relationship. So first, 40 volunteers suffering from insomnia divided into two groups. One group is assigned a specialty no dessert diet. The other group continue with desserts as usual. And then half of the people in each of these groups were assigned to an exercise program, and those who ate no desserts and engaged in exercise showed the most improvement. And so the question is, did we just observe a group of people go about their daily life and collect the data, or were there treatments imposed on different groups of people to establish a cause and effect relationship? Yes, this is definitely an experiment because there were treatments imposed. People were divided up and assigned things. So that's one of your key words. They were assigned dessert and no dessert, and they were assigned an exercise problem. That's not you going about your natural daily life if you're assigned a change. So that's what makes this an experiment. Here, a study in California showed students enrolled in music class have higher GPAs than students who do not. So, in this case, we are just observing data about students who are enrolled or not enrolled in music classes. There's not been any assignments made, any treatments imposed. It's just observing what's already happening. So this is just an observation.